Welcome back to Side Quest VIII. I'm going to start saying Side Quest 8. Episode 21, talking about Final Fantasy VIII. And, well, back with me is my perennial party member and constant companion. Got that mixed up last time. Wes Schantz. Good to see you, Wes.
It's all good. Here I am. How are you?
I'm doing well. And like you said last time, just to jump into things without giving the summary first, the game seems to really be pulling with Diablos-like gravitational force towards the end, either magnetic or gravitational, if you want to use Plato's ion as an example, magnets, or gravitation with Diablos, or just talk about the unfolding of a narrative and how it gains not only momentum, but also sort of blinders, linearity almost. And I wonder if our experience is itself not being compressed in the same way as this time compression that we've heard about in this most recent playthrough from Rinoa's mouth, now not possessed, but also now a sorceress, my goodness, who has Idea's powers. Something we'll have to talk about. That wasn't even in my notes. Shows the value of them. And so in this time compressed universe, apparently, and this is something I think we've said, but now we've seen it in the narrative itself, there could be one being and all time is reduced to basically one moment. But I wonder if that itself is not being mirrored in the ludic element and the ludicology of the game right now. It feels like we're being having the blinders put on precisely when we would have the capacity to see the most in the world. Like you've been saying, and I keep trying to be sensitive to the fact that there's going to be a point of no return soon, where the world changes, where we're like on disc 4 and time compression has happened, and all of a sudden none of the mini games and much of the world disappears for us, kind of like Final Fantasy VI. And I think this is a conceit that happens in a lot of games, but especially RPGs and JRPGs, where the world changes to like the end game state, and that's like irreversible, irrevocable. Like even Chrono Trigger has that to some extent. Chrono Cross for sure when the dragons are present. Final Fantasy VII when there's a meteor in the sky. And the music changes even when you're on the high wind, right? Like you don't have that triumphant music. You have that sort of somber music. In any case, it's good to see you, Wes. And I want to talk about all of these elements, but I probably should give the summary with a lot of your input first.
Okay.
And how I wanted to start that, again, backwards as usual, is by admitting that when we started our project, I no longer had a PS1 or PS2, and I didn't have any of my original games. Very sad. But I bought a PS3 when it was already 10 years old then. I still have that PS3, and I still have that Final Fantasy VII save. But since then, I upgraded to a Final Fantasy IV, or sorry, that's how conflated these things are for me, PlayStation and Final Fantasy. A PlayStation 4 to play Final Fantasy VII Remake, and then recently a PS5, which allowed me to import my PS4 data onto it. And so I'm playing Final Fantasy VIII on a PS5. And the controller feels a lot like the old PS1 and PS2 controllers that I knew so well, but it is a little bit different. And something interesting about it, at the very least, is that apparently a feature of the PS5 is that it auto records the last 15 minutes to an hour of your gameplay. So while you're playing, you're being recorded. And I thought that was a really interesting feature. I don't know, I didn't generate a normative feeling for that yet, or a desired use, but I just thought that's just an interesting function of the PS5. Not something that the PS1 did. And so I wonder if I can go back and look at things if I'm interested in that. I imagine that's the whole reason. But so last time we made it to the Ragnarok, we made it to just before we were going to talk to Elene. We talked to her. We learned that one cannot change the past, even though Squall wants to change the past and wants to see for himself. But she says, and this is what I think the whole point of the whole game is, and what this most recent article I wrote about Final Fantasy VIII is about, is she says you can't change the past. What changes is you, because you
Mhm.
learn new things about the past. And so ostensibly going into the past changes the present and the future. And that's in some ways supposed to model like in education, right? You learn the mistakes of the past so that you do not repeat them in the future. You don't try to go back to the past in order to prevent them from happening in the first place. And that seems to be the wisdom that LNA is conveying to Squall. He is still in this emotional state, which I would say I don't approve of, but see in an enantiodromia sort of way, where he's gone from one opposite to another, where he's gone from too stoic and cold to now too sort of hot-headed and irrational. And so he's being very demanding, so much so that to when they abandon ship because Rinoa has been possessed by Ultimecia and has started to free Adel while the Lunar Cry has begun, because the lunatic Pandora with its crystal pillar, and there's Final Fantasy getting its motif right there. There's a crystal pillar in the lunatic Pandora instead of, like a crystal or a crystal chronicle or a legend of crystals, drawing the monsters down. So all hell is breaking loose on the moon and on Earth. Not only are a huge amount of monsters now going to go down in a concentrated force, apparently they're going to go down with Adel, who not only has the first seal released by Rinoa, but then Rinoa in a spacesuit releases the second seal. And I continue to reiterate that Adel is humongous in scale compared to Rinoa. And recently read an article where she was described as being 12 feet tall compared to my 14. And so Adel is humongous. The point was also made, though, about Adel's gender, that obviously Adel is a sorceress and part of the procession of sorceresses and is referred to as she within the game. And so
Mhm.
I thought that would be important to note, even with Adel's very different appearance from other figures within the game. But so Adel is seemingly freed. We get this sort of Xenogears and falling angel and sort of Sephirothian imagery and a CGI, that very CGI heavy bit.
Mhm.
A lot of dialogue, not as much plain, kind of boring in some ways, but there are these falling angel wings from the heavens with this red cloud of monsters coming down. And that's what's come down to Earth by the time we make it to Earth. Squall, in his bravery / foolhardiness, then attempts to escape from an escape pod in an astronaut suit, makes physical contact with Rinoa with no plan. He just goes out there to see her, and Elena's like, "You already know what to do." She's very sort of manic pixie fairy supportive in that moment, and he says, "Thanks, sis." And Quistis is like, "What is going on here?" as the voice of reason, sort of a Minerva-esque figure here. Squall runs into Rinoa, and this is where I think the romance and implausibilities might nauseate somebody who doesn't really love this game, but he says, "I don't know what to do." And then they both look up, and there's this giant spaceship like 100 meters away from them. It's like, how could you especially in space where there are no obstacles at all? That is not something that one would miss, and you just acted so recklessly, Squall. And I think sort of trolls on internet, on like Quora or Reddit, would probably say that is some epic plot armor that
Mhm.
they didn't make it to the Ragnarok. Apparently, there's an infestation, a very strange one, of these propagators, of which there are 8, 4 different colors, and you have to kill them. This is Rinoa's analysis. It's very helpful in pairs. Or you can just kill 25 and farm them of AP because they count as boss battles. So they juice up your GFs without increasing your levels, which is nice because Rinoa is level 12 for me,
Sweet.
which made it so that I could one hit all the propagators, doing about 3,700 with my Ultima enhanced strength.
Mhm.
But it'll be hard to see whether I keep old Ultima there, because if I put it on elemental defense, I all of a sudden become I have almost 100% defense against every element, and that's pretty strong too. in any case, so we get to the Ragnarok, we break the infestation. We hear from S-Star. S-Star is also printed very clearly on the Ragnarok. And they're like, oh, you heard us. Oh, you're there? It's been 17 years. So another 17 years, like the radio tower at Dalit, like so many things.
Mhm.
The Ragnarok is coming back to life. There's this circularity. So we talked a little bit about final. Last time, but even in terms of it, doubleness as well to the creatures on it. And they themselves have sort of a circularity, right? Because they can be almost de facto infinite if you kill them in the wrong order. And so there's and they're literally called propagators. And so they're a very strange manner of creature. In any case, we make it with the help of the S-Star control tower back down to S-Star. And right when we do that, what should happen? But Rinoa has to be taken off to be sealed herself like Adel, because she is a sorceress. So Squall finally sort of acts out his love for her, even though when he sees her and she's freed of Ultimecia for the moment, and they have a chance to hug, he doesn't hug her at first. And
Right.
even when they're sitting in the Ragnarok, he says, look at our situation. And it's like, Squall, look what you just did in an even more dire situation. But he decides to be taciturn and stoic. But he does eventually share a hug with her, and Eyes on Me is played with a vocal edition of it. And so it's pretty sappy, but it is in an emotionally charged situation where Squall has risked his life to finally catch Rinoa, but Rinoa has apparently received the succession of Hein and is now a sorceress, and because of that, needs to be locked away forever. So the moment he opens up to somebody, and the moment he gets her back, he's got to lose her again, and may have lost her forever. She is in fact a sorceress now. And I think that's a really interesting dynamic. It's not like Rinoa is just his girlfriend. Rinoa is a very complicated character on her own rights, with her own political aspirations for freedom, for timber, and then her own complicated relationship with her father, who's a Galbadian functionary, and now with the fact that she shares in this long Edenic, or sorry, like Eve-like lineage of the power of Hein, which makes one then also part of the succession of sorceresses that leads to the end of creation through Ultimecia. And so kind of a bummer for Squall.
Yeah, I think this is the first time the name Hein is mentioned in like necessary text. And there's of course no explanation like what that means, uh, per the usual. So this is another situation where on a second playthrough or on a more thorough exploratory kind of playthrough, you get a much better feel for what is going on and what's at stake. Versus in this one, we're kind of close in with Squall's own perspective on things, where he's just kind of going from mission to mission as much as possible, being efficient and excellent in a very limited way, and really not knowing the bigger picture at all, but just being focused on the immediate. And I was kind of surprised that he lets her walk away, but that does seem to fit with his personality. His dilemma has shifted from, should I um, be a leader or be a good uh, boyfriend slash lover for this one person, and it's something more like, should I allow her to make her own choice, right? Or should I assert my will now that it's finally kind of awakening within me? And it's interesting that there's still this element of restraint, right? As much as you might think this is the big moment, this is the big shift, it's really not. He's still not going to pull the trigger just yet, right? She goes off of her own volition with the S-Star attendants or whatever it is that they're taking her to be kind of sealed away because she is a sorceress. Yeah, so now um, that's where I left off. I don't have the rest of my party back. I know that you pretty quickly get the rest of the party members though. So there's this weird kind of limbo where it's like, what is the next move in this game going to be? Is it a kind of World of Ruin situation where you have to go and recover your party, a la Final Fantasy VI, or is it more like what we've seen so far, where there's these very quick shifts between a party of one or two, and then the full party reunited again, and while Rinoa is not playable at the moment, again, peeking ahead, we know that she's going to rejoin the team pretty soon. So um, I yeah, I was blown away by some of the dialogue here and the ways that Squall is finally opening up. But at the same time, I was kind of surprised that he doesn't fully make the switch to pursuing his own his own path, right? He's still willing to defer.
Yeah, it's interesting what you say, his thoughts on autonomy and agency, and how he feels that he has no right to keep Rinoa from making her own decisions, for her to access her own agency. I also wanted to mention this was a pretty rich part in terms of illusions. We talked last time about the Xenogears, Final Fantasy VII, to 2001: Space Odyssey. But also, of course, the Star Wars. We have a Piet character like Admiral Piet, who's in our own space pod, and I think it's the captain of the ship. He's at least on the bridge. And there's also the little ship that's tethered to the lunar space station. It looks just like a TIE fighter. It's used as a camera, but it looks like a very clear homage to Star Wars. I also wanted to mention that in there was two sort of potential inconsistencies that I don't know. So, and maybe this was a localization issue on one count, but Squall yells "God" at one point in the escape pods. And that's an interesting reference to religion. Again, we only have had the one mention of Hein, who is in fact the god of the world that's unnamed, or Final Fantasy VIII. Localized potentially, sure. It's a powerful exclamation. But it would be interesting that somebody in that world might have the same expression. Particularly given the one God we learn about and what his relationship to people is, not really benevolent, even though he is the creator. Also, LNA reiterates over and over again to Squall that she can only send somebody back to the past of somebody that she knew.
Yeah.
So she can send somebody to Laguna's past because she knew Laguna in the past. And so that's actually a pretty strong constraint on her powers. She's like a little kid, right? She knew like 6 people. She can't really do this with that many people. Like Rain,
Yeah.
Laguna. It's not an infinite story. But even though she doesn't know Rinoa, she does manage to send Squall to her pretty recent past 3 times, and 3 different places. And one of them is when she is attempting to convince Irving to take her back to the district prison, where they do save us.
Yeah.
And we talked about that. So it was very necessary that she had this fight. And one was to show her with Ultimecia's wings. And
Yes.
and then there was another one. In any case, when she's with Irving, I just wanted to bring this up because I thought this was actually laugh out loud funny. Um, she says, "You know how Squall is? He might say, 'I haven't been ordered to escape,' and not escape." And so
It's great. Yes.
so had a pretty good beat on his personality even then. And I'm surprised that Squall didn't get a little like dialogue, grayed out dialogue box there, like, hey, I'm not that like, stodgy or whatever. But no, he just took that one. But yeah, so I did want to mention, so apparently LNA can use this power not with just people she knew in the past, in this instance, or I don't know, is this like a power of love thing or something going on there? And the other one that I mentioned, as well, the god mentioned as
Hmm.
well. What do you think?
I took the translating of the memories to be a little bit of a power of love thing, but I think you could argue that because she knows each of the other people in each case, right? She knows Irving, she knows Zell. That's the other one where Zell's talking to her about the ring, and you're kind of watching it from like behind a glass on a table. It's very stylized, cinematic. Um, and the glass on the table is, for me, it was reminiscent of that little puzzle where you're trying to escape the locked room in her house, right? You have to move the glass to go over
Hmm.
by the statue. And and then so like she knows Zell, so she could have been in Zell's memory there. She could have been in Irving's memory in the other the prison thing. And then she could have been in Cypher's memory with that, you know, that crucial scene where we finally see the shadow of Ultimecia, the bright shadow behind her, the ghost-like figure with the dark angel wings, yeah, and the horns. Um, and also Misha sees us seeing her. So there's a really interesting kind of mutual recognition there. Um, Now the only problem then is like we'd also go, I think, into her, we have like a cinematic of her out in space. And so if that is Elena doing that, I think it has to be with the power of the Griever ring itself, right? Which Rinoa still has. So if that's like a character that LNA knows in some sense, I guess that would be a real stretch. But yeah, it seems like she's kind of operating at the limit of her power. And like she said to Squall, right? Like the only thing that this connection accomplishes is seeing how you are changing and seeing. I think she says like how much she is loved, right? That she can't change the past, she can't overcome what happened, but she can realize how much Laguna loved her, how much Squall loves her, and now Squall in turn realizing how much Rinoa loves him. And what that means, I think, is that Rinoa can't possibly die. It's like a Matrix kind of thing as well, which is right around the same time. She's effectively dead. There's no oxygen in the spacesuit, and yet she survives. And then Squall goes out, and his oxygen runs out, and yet they both survive long enough to get on board this miraculous appearance of the empty spacecraft that's been floating in space for 17 years and suddenly is in exactly the right spot at exactly the right moment. So there's some, yeah, sort of fated thing happening, I want to say, that's stronger than any individual's power. Now, when, you know, he cries out to God, yeah, I took that more as just a kind of heart-rending cry, and that's the strongest word that could be placed there and uh, be printable or something like that. So I didn't really make the further connection of like, what does this mean within the the world of the game? But it is conspicuous. Yeah, I don't think we've seen anyone else use that terminology that I can remember. And when they're talking in the Ragnarok, Squall um, is also reminded of his words about being someone else's memory, right? So Rinoa also has like a good grasp of specific things that he has said throughout the adventure, and she kind of brings that up. Um, I don't know to what end exactly, except to maybe just show how well she knows him, something like that. But yeah, they do seem determined to live against all odds. And it is, it's pretty cheesy at certain parts, but it is powerful, right? The drifting in space, and it goes on in very Space Odyssey sort of fashion. But you're really on the edge of your seat, like, are they going to make it? And I think it can mess up and have to redo it. So, um, there's some strong incentive to get it right. And yeah, the same goes with like the alien kind of thing going on with the Ragnarok ship, right? There's a lot of jump scares. There's a lot of potential frustration if you start killing these monsters in the wrong order, and if you aren't really prepared, this could be a really sticky part of the game. But yeah, it's super easy as long as you've been kind of on top of things so far. So yeah.
I wanted to mention also to the point you made, or the point we're making about cycling and doubling, that there's also the double Griever ring, which floats up in front of Rinoa's face right before she presses the button on her suit that then gives her oxygen for some or life support for some greater amount of time. So even though she
Hmm.
had run out, so I guess it's like some extra source that she had, and all of a sudden uh rebirth. And so there's sort of an interesting sort of nuptial symbolism there with the two rings and the new life, and it is very nuptial in these moments, right? There's a sort of Dido and Aeneas element in that they are alone on this ship with this creature called a propagator together, and she now has his ring. It is a highly suggestive set of moments, not to mention the fact that it was in fact in relation to the High Wind, the airship that one had on disc 3 of Final Fantasy VII, when very famously Cloud lays down at night with Tifa, and everybody
Mm.
on the ship sees them. Um, and that's hashed out the next month. Um, and very interesting, the sort of doubling cyclical symbolism related to them, especially also with, of course, the succession having happened, with Idea having released her powers to Rinoa, and her now receiving um, this this thing that happens successively, generation after generation, cycles in and out. Um, but to that point, I also wanted to mention the juxtaposition between Cypher and Squall. That again, Squall gets described as a knight in shining armor. Um, right when we find out that Cypher is still, in fact, the knight of a sorceress, but it is to Ultimecia, not to Idea, ultimately. Um, and that Ultimecia speaks to him, and she says that if he gets the submerged lunatic Pandora from beneath the waves where Estar put it, where the Galbadians under his control have to find it and do find it, that she'll give him dreams again.
Hmm.
Wanted to mention that this again, I think, shows the slight difference between the path of the hero that slash path of the night that Cypher and Squall are pursuing. That Cypher is pursuing the unconscious one. That he is literally pursuing being given dreams,
Yeah.
or as if what he is like he has been given heroin, as in I'll give you dreams, not necessarily that you will achieve your dreams. He might think he's living out his dream, but I think again that Squall is more acting out the role, where Cypher is acting out the role in an unconscious or dreamlike way, or in a dream space in his own mind.
Yeah. And this is very dreamlike, right? It's very surreal. Yes, they're alone. There's in a way no consequences because they might not even survive, right? And so there is a kind of romantic out of time quality to it, like a a few things that they say though when they do finally get through the um, kind of puzzle battles with the propagators, and you make it to the bridge of the ship. Rinoa is talking about how Squall has missed out on so much, right? And how she wants this moment paradoxically to last forever.
Yes.
So she sort of is wanting two impossible things, right? For him to have had certain experiences that he can't recover, specifically like the the comfort and safety of a parent's love, and the physical kind of being held that is part of that. and then also that she wants to stay with him, right, and not go back because she realizes that she's going to turn herself in. He doesn't realize this. The player probably doesn't realize this until it happens. And so there's a kind of yeah, really bittersweet quality to this kind of cheesy over the top love scene that is really powerful. And again, his restraint is supreme in this moment, right? She's sitting on his lap, and yet he lets her go and keeps insisting that she strap herself into her seatbelt, you know, and be safe. And then she finally does sit apart from him and tells him, you know, what's about to happen is she's gonna reveal herself as a sorceress and take the consequences, right? And yeah, there's this really interesting quality of the uh, the necessity of reconnecting with the others, right? As soon as they're back with the others, she's gonna be taken away from him again, and he's having to process this as, you know, it looked like they were finally going to be together, and of course they have to be separated right away. So I think, you know, Squall's um, inability to connect with her, even for this brief moment, um, is, uh, is a powerful kind of riff on that love scene from Final Fantasy VII, right, where they spend the night on and are seen by everyone. This is the opposite. No one can see them, and yet they don't have any physical intimacy. Um, and even the way Rinoa is talking about it is almost like making it impossible, I think, because she's connecting it so closely with the love of a parent,
Mhm.
and that's, you know, something that would not tend to arouse that kind of desire. You know, so she's keeping it on this kind of still very playful, very um, you know, PG kind of level for all that she's, you know, in his lap and they're alone. Um, yeah, so I found it to be a really effective, you know, sequence all taken all together of between the flashbacks, the space drifting, the sort of playable cinematics is really engrossing. You know, the whole alien battling stuff. Like you finally get to do something, even though the battles are kind of, you know, just uh, perfunctory, and then you finally get this kind of powerful, um, dramatic situation where he, you know, he admits like he's fallen for her, and yet he has to let her make her own choice. Um, so yeah, so
Yeah.
I think it's great. It's great storytelling.
Well, and I mean, I'll add to that. So right after right where we get to basically at the end, we get back to Earth. We've got our life, but what have we lost? Well, we lose Rinoa, who we've just forged this really powerful bond with, saved her life, basically admitted all these powerful feelings. So is she, and share a ring with her, and just had this crazy experience and have to give her up. So it is this equivalent to losing Aerith in Final Fantasy VII. You know, so it's different. She's alive. She was saved. But can she be saved from her fate? And that's the big question that Squall is asking. That's the question that people who want Final Fantasy VII's conclusion and major moments to change should ask themselves. Um, but so, um, right. Rinoa is Rinoa, or the relationship to Rinoa seems to be lost. Well, the very next thing we learn when we get back on the Ragnarok, right after that scene, and Quistis comes in. Quistis interestingly says, "I'm home," which reminds me
Hmm.
quite a bit of FH when all the people get out of the busted thing from D, D District, the armored unit from D District.
Yeah, yeah.
And then the Balam Garden music turns on, even though you're in the middle of Fisherman's Harbor, FH. And but Quista says, "I'm home" when she runs onto the Ragnarok and sees Squall. Nobody else is there, and it's not Balam Garden. But I just think that that's an interesting moment. Again, that could be a localization issue, but I think it just shows the basicness of the party dynamic.
Mhm.
And actually, right after her, Selfie and Irving come in suggestively again. Why was it just those two together? And also Zell, and the basic unit is back to back together. again. But what we learn is that when Quistis hit the ground, uh, that Piet was there. It looks like there had been a struggle, and Elena is gone. So now Sis and this new love interest, the two people who Squall has in his life after not having had parents, are now gone again. Briefly, he had them, sort of had them. Elena has that sort of feeling. There's probably a name for this trope, like ghostly girl or something like that. That she's never quite there, even when she is there. That one doesn't feel that there's an intangibility to her character, like she's just going to float away, sort of like the mother from Darjeeling Limited, by Wes Anderson. Maybe an insubstantiality to her. But in one fell swoop, Squall loses everything that he has gained. At least along one dimension, along like the personal, sort of familial love dimension in his life. He still is obviously, he still has his friends. He has this Ragnarok now. And he is also the head of Garden as its military leader for the moment. So, and also has all of the experiences and the powers that he's gained along the way, which are substantial. So he hasn't lost everything, but he's coming back to Earth for him is both a metaphor and a concrete reality in this. Because he really hits the Earth hard, and even though it's not necessarily the world of ruin, and that one is yet in a time compressed state where the world is irrevocably changed, his personal world, which has been transforming this whole time, is changed at this moment. It is sort of like a ruined world in some ways for him without Rinoa, and now not knowing where Elena is as well. In terms of his sort of moral compass, or his, I don't know, his orientation to the world being reliant on his fundamental relationships.
Yeah, and it's a rude awakening, right? It's like he and Cypher again. There's this kind of contrast that's illuminating for both, where Cypher wants to receive those dreams from his female figure of authority, of desire. Squall had the dream, and yet is willing to let it kind of just have been, and let it become a memory. But of course, by the time this next little sequence happens, we're headed to kind of save her. All right, so there's something about, I guess, his connection with the party, their support of him, that is going to help convert what was an impossible dream into a waking reality, and one that is going to lead us, although not right away, to that kind of ultimate point that the game seems to be driving at, right? Of the confrontation with Ultimecia, the time compression, and the will to live, kind of confronting one another, and two kinds of fate placed into conflict directly. I think the Ragnarok itself, right? Its name is quite, you know, powerful. It's one that is present in a lot of different games in different ways. But in this case, it's juxtaposed with like the garden, right? So it's your flying device. This one is a true airship, spaceship even. So we don't know its full capacity yet, but by golly, we're going to have an airship at some point, and it looks like this is it. And the garden is like the beginning, right? In the Judeo-Christian narrative, and the Ragnarok in the Norse mythology is the end, right? The end of all things, when Loki, the wolf, uh, his Fenris wolf wakes up, and Loki and his other children, I forget all of the ones, I think Hel is involved, right? His daughter, and they go and they start wreaking havoc, and the fire giants and the ice giants all kind of break up from the order that's been established, and start undoing everything, right? And it's fated to be the death of the gods, right? That's the weird kind of twist about the Norse version of the story is the gods are going to lose. And maybe there's a new creation after that, maybe not. It's a little unclear, depending on what canon you're looking at there. But the idea of like a fated end does seem to be really closely connected with this ship itself, right? Um, its ability to rescue is kind of an interesting spin on that whole idea, right? It's being in the right place at the right time. And I don't know if we're going to get a backstory here about what the Ragnarok was doing up there, um, but I can't help but see uh, a kind of larger purpose here. So whether we call it Hein or whether it's LNA, Odin, Laguna, that kind of side of things, or like yeah, like you said, just pure plot armor, and that's all we need to know. Um, at any rate, there's uh, a kind of question about what is this story that we're in, right? Is it a garden type story, or is it a Ragnarok type story, or is it one that is trying to embrace and somehow transcend, or vary the the um, the best of both of those? Yeah. So I found it um, yeah really interesting to think about in that sense. And it's kind of funny that we don't get to rename the ship. I was kind of surprised by that also. Like, it seems like the kind of thing that this game would want you to rename, but it doesn't let you. So, yeah.
Well, to that point, I'd like to mention that there are two distinct points during this playthrough where we hear Lunary Fatale, or at least some version of that
Mm.
sort of distorted, creepy way when Ultimecia is present. One when we're in the past and she's moving Rinoa to Cypher and is in the back. And then there's another moment. I don't remember whether it's when she's possessing Rinoa's body and you keep getting thrown. I think it might be during that moment as
Mhm.
well. But the name of that song, Liberi Fatale, which is bad Latin, it should be Liberi Fatalis. Um,
Yeah.
but but they tried, means fated children. And
Yes.
so to your point about fate and agency, what we've been talking about the entire time with Squall's feelings of wanting agency and not wanting to be denied agency by being dropped into one's memory and no longer having the capacity to act in the world, sort of like Achilles' own view of how much it sucks to be stuck in people's memories when he's in book 11 of the Odyssey,
Mm.
when he's in the underworld. But so these are the fated children approaching now on a Ragnarok, um, and Squall is continuing to have difficulties with understanding the bounds of his own personal choice and its relation to other people's choice. I think in some ways he has a very sophisticated notion here because what he's been fighting against all along has been the boundaries on his own will. But
Mm.
here I think he's admitting of an appropriate boundary on his will, which is not to attempt to supervene on the will of another, um, which which is a very powerful lesson. I don't see that necessarily as a mistake on his part, but also
Oh,
we have this interesting like interludic moment where we get insight into his thoughts with just a black screen.
yeah.
And I thought that was a really interesting break in the narrative or break in the action. It's pure narrative, right? So it is literally a break in the action, not a break in the narrative. Um, but so we've seen this Ragnarok. We've moved on from Ragnarok from Garden, if we want to just like sort of speak in this Jacques Lacan wordplay way. Experienced a black screen, which is itself a break in the action, the ludic element. It's highly non-ludic, right? You don't even
Mm.
have a scenery around. What would you even do in this area? You just can read. It's like a page in a book, in some ways. But also an end game sort of state as well, right? The black screen that says game over. But so I wanted to say that a lot of these elements are at least getting mishmashed together. And I wanted to connect that moment with the notion of fate and of being constrained as well, because the player is, your attention is focused down to just some text in that moment. And that's your gameplay experience. And you can press X to move the text forward, and that's all you can do. So it's like reading, a book at this, or a digital reader, as it were, in this moment. Yeah.
I think that's when the Vikos Lusek comes back in, actually.
Yes, it is.
I think it's playing during that. Yeah.
It is during that. I do remember that because it's such a creepy rendition of it. It's very distorted, something like Vikos, like very haunted. And yeah, right. And so, Phytos Lusek related to the literary fatale during the black screen after having just fought these propagators on the Ragnarok with this newly minted witch next to one. I mean, there's also very space opera and Renaissance epic in these respects. The game's imagery and mythology is sort of collapsing on itself with its richness, but also just a lot is happening all at once. New airship and now new powers with this character who we've known all along, and this other one now has to go on sort of an epic quest to save her, Lancelot in the Cart-esque style or Orlando style. And so in some ways it also becomes, in its very non-typical way, like a typical RPG, in that Mario has to go get Princess Peach. But it's because Princess Peach is so powerful that she's now going to occupy this passive role, right? Because the power of Rinoa cannot be contained without being literally contained and sealed. And in some way, she is related to this Morgan Le Fay-esque character, this Ultimecia, who we're learning more and more about, but we're liking less and less. And there's this other feminine figure who's just been released into the world, Adel, who it's looking like the biggest threats we've ever faced have now been sort of a Pandora's box-esque and Lunatic Pandora released into the world. And Adel seems like the most destructive iteration of Ultimecia's world wrath so far. And with all of these references to how bad it would be that you mentioned on the lunar station if she were to get free, but now the Lunar Cry has happened, and Ultimecia is possibly going to possess her, who has this even worse endgame than Adel did, which was just pure, war and subjugation. And Rinoa is gone, and the LNA. I talked about disorienting moments, but the sheer orientation of this moment is disorienting. One would want to get disoriented. It's dizzying now what the scale of things is. It's like, this is what it takes to be the hero of Light Squall. You have to beat this and this and this level of enemy. And he doesn't necessarily want to, but in order to achieve his ends, like ensuring the safety of Rinoa and his friends, he's going to have to. And so he's going to have to continue to grow. I mean, I think we saw a really interesting iteration of this when we get into the Ragnarok, and he's like, how am I supposed to fly this thing? It's like, how are you supposed to save the world, Squall? You better figure out how to fly this spaceship. I mean, I understand in a realistic situation, figuring out how to fly, a spaceship, let alone a plane of some sort, something that can fly, would be sort of absurd. But this is a moment where I think we as players, if we take a second to really look at it, the odds seem sort of insurmountable. And maybe as a player, you do start to feel this when you start to think about just the scale and power of some of the enemies that are coming up.
Yeah, there's that cutscene where you see all of the monsters, right? And they are sort of swirling around this central pillar, and it looks like an eye. And then
Yes.
sure enough, you zoom into the eye of one of the kind of fish monsters that's swimming in space. And that's just one of this kind of infinite horde that's pouring out, engulfing Adele and then carrying Adele into the lunatic Pandora. Yeah, where she's kind of like I don't know what is going on, like these bands of light, come out to connect with her. Um, yeah, it's pretty overwhelming. And yeah, that sequence where she's controlling Rinoa is incredibly creepy, right? She doesn't
Yes.
even bother to use Rinoa to kill anyone. I don't think anyone's killed in that part, but she chooses to use Rinoa to release Adele over using Rinoa with all the power that she possesses in that moment to do anything directly, which should indicate that this thing Adele is even beyond, right, the normal level of a sorceress. Whatever we're up against, it's truly terrifying. And yeah, the kind of uncanny movement that Renoa's body is like a kind of marionette with broken
Yes.
strings or something, right? And the light that pursues, it's all uh, yeah, incredibly unsettling. I also noticed that the radio tower wishes them Godspeed. So there's another kind of reference
Ah,
there,
yes. Good. Good.
that comes in quick succession, right? With him shouting God. So that idea of having success, that's smiled on by the deity. Apparently, there's some you know remnant of that faith, perhaps in Estar still. They're the ones who talk about Hein's descendant as well. So they seem to have some ability to like read what's going on in a religious way. Um, but yeah.
So you make me want to maybe conclude the conversation today by talking about a similarity between Ultimecia and Sephiroth, and again, a difference between Squall's learning and Ultimecia's. We've already talked about the fact that he needs to recognize that he's going to die, and she is refusing to recognize that. But also, we're seeing a fundamental difference in their perceptions of human agency and its value. He seems to not want to constrain the will of another person with sort of negative liberty ideas here, which I personally very much appreciate. Whereas she, and I think we talked about this earlier, but this comes full force here. Ultimacia has no compunction at all about completely occupying the body of another person from another time. So not and totally taking over their their existence, like a yerk from Animorphs. And so she rapes people in a way that is far beyond a physical one, in that she totally takes someone's will, or in some ways it could even be seen as worse than a murder. What she does, it's something that we're incapable of doing in so-called real life or regular life. But so something I wanted to mention is that this seems to be a power that she shares with Sephiroth, but perfects in a way. They both have this capacity, and we see this all throughout with Sephiroth projecting his will, which is so powerful that it overcomes Genova's alien cells within him, and he's the only person known to affect Genova rather than be affected by Genova. Even the whole Cetra race couldn't manage to deal with that, but Sephiroth could. But he can only project his will over space, and particularly over people who also have Genova cells. And so his capacity is to, rather than mastering himself, he masters others. He enslaves others to his will. Ultimecia does the same thing with first Adea and then Rinoa, and perhaps also will do the same with Adele. But I'm very much reminded of the imagery or the words of Sephiroth after he has killed Ares and Genova has been defeated at the end of Disc 1 in Final Fantasy VII, where he says, "Stop pretending that you care." And Cloud's like, "What are you talking about?" He says, "Because you're just a puppet," and then he flies off. But like you said, Rinoa looks like a marionette. But what's scary, perhaps even scarier about Ultimecia, is that she not only exerts her will over space, but also over time and back into the past. So she, unlike Elone, unlike Squall, has not learned the lesson that you cannot change the past. You can just change yourself through gaining new perspective from the past. She thinks you can change the past, wants to deny death, and has no problem constraining the wills of others. These are like the three major things that a human has to learn. That you respect others, or whatever version of that you sort of honor or legally have to honor, and that you're going to die and you should make the most of your time, and that what you should and that mastering yourself is more important than mastering others, I guess, or something like that. But right, so Ultimecia, even worse than Sephiroth, exerts her will or exudes her will, not only through space but through time and against the will of others. Now against Rinoa, using her to do things that Rinoa would never want to do, which then leads to Rinoa having to be sealed. So for crimes that she did not will, and for a power she didn't wish to receive, Rinoa is now being punished.
Wait, I'm suddenly realizing if they can just exorcise Ultimecia from Medea and it's no problem, why do they have to seal Rinoa away? I don't get that. But anyway, I don't know. Maybe it's something about the succession or something. But also, what you're saying makes me think about this whole problem of the remake, though, right? Like, I don't know what's going on with Sephiroth in the remake, but I know that he's doing some shenanigans that involve changing the events of the original game. And so it does seem like he has availed himself of some Ultimecia type time compression towers there.
Learned through Dissidia and their interactions, and
Uh,
there's something reaching through the various time spaces. Either he or Ultimecia or some sort of collaboration has made that possible. That's interesting because, yeah, you can see then the development of his concept is based on that concept's extension in Final Fantasy VIII, and Ultimecia's willingness to try and destroy another person's world and their life in order to save her own. It reminds me very much of I think the king's name is Alcestis, the one whose wife gives up her life in order for him to stay alive. He's offered this ultimatum that he can leave Hades and stay alive if anybody will die for him. And his parents won't do it, and nobody will do it in his kingdom, but it's his wife will do it.
she's the wife. Yeah, Alcestis is the wife, and the king is Admetus.
Yes,
The
yes,
version that Wikipedia is showing me right now. Yeah,
yes.
yeah, yeah, yeah.
I read about that in a Euripides play that's about Hercules. But he's visiting the house right after this. Alcestis has made this choice for her husband, and he's trying to drink and party, and he's like, "Why is everybody so sad?" But but Ultimecia makes the opposite sort of choice.
Yeah.
Or rather, she makes the choice that the king is willing to make. That she's totally happy, like perhaps a god, to have someone sacrifice themselves for her. But that is, I think, perhaps the most sort of heretical and maybe like red tape thing that one can do, because Ultimecia, even though she has the partial power of a god, Hein, she's also limited by the fact that there's a succession. There's a genealogy to it that suggests that there's a change, that there's a limit, a temporality to it. This is something I think we're going to see in Final Fantasy IX rear its head again, too. A creature of profound power then run up against temporal limitations, and not have an appropriate adapted response to that. Again, I think instead of this creature choosing to try and save itself, I think it chooses to destroy the world, and is pretty successful at it, which is maybe the Sephiroth solution too.
Right. And then, yeah, what you said about sacrifice made me think back to the very start of the game, where the first GFs that we get Quetzalcoatl, Shiva, both closely connected with kind of religious rituals of death and destruction that lead to rebirth, right?
Mhm.
And so there's that Ragnarok idea again, kind of bookending the game. And the question of like, yeah, is the sacrifice willing or unwilling seems to be really important. And you know, the whole thing is about these kind of child soldiers. And I
Yeah.
just don't know what to make of that. I still don't know. At the end of the day, if I think this game is on the level, I just I'm I'm of two minds about the whole premise of this game, and having the question of fate dealt with in quite this fashion. But it's certainly interesting. It's certainly provocative, uh, and it occupies a really important kind of hinge point within the succession of Final Fantasies. That's for sure. So yeah, looking at nine will be fun when we get there.
Okay, so what are the lessons that we needed to learn? I think I forgot one of them when I listed them last time. One is do not extend one's agency over another. This is emphasized by Ultimecia, subjecting other people to her will. The other one is that one needs to accept one's own mortality.
Mhm.
And then there was a third one I thought um, that Ultimecia was teaching us that she did wrong, not accepting her own fate, not accepting a necessary constraint on her will. And I guess maybe this point is just adjacent to the other, not realizing that self mastery is more important than mastery over others. But I mean,
Yeah,
there's
the
also
refinement of the basic first rule. Yeah, yeah,
yeah, and I mean, of course, also we could say that she doesn't understand that the party is the fundamental unit, which is something that you cannot understand if you have the sort of Sephiroth, Luciferian, Ultimacia perspective that you are the most important thing in the universe.
yeah.
Because it's a fundamental misapprehension. Because it's the party, at least in the RPG sphere or the Christian sphere, is the fundamental most important thing. And I mean, this may be debatable Christian wise, but you know, where two or three are present in my name is what I'm thinking. The church is supposed to be a unity, but it's made up of a plurality of people, assume, like a state, as it were. But yeah, so Ultimacia is teaching us very effectively what we should not be pursuing and how not to live. And so I suppose I can say that I appreciate that from her. And I look forward to further lessons from her and how not to live as we progress on. And I guess by this next time we might have to defeat Adele, but I think after we defeat Adele, that's when sort of the world changes forever. And so maybe we need to take some time to play some side quests and things. Or I think I'll take a look at the IGN strategy guide and see what it suggests at this point with the Ragnarok now. I don't know.
Yeah.
I don't know what level of challenge you're looking for in this game. I know when we played seven, neither of us took on Emerald or Ruby weapon. But are you intending to try and get Eden from the underground research laboratory?
I'll try, but I'm not gonna spend a lot of hours grinding. And yeah, I'm okay not 100%ing the game. I
Yeah.
couldn't get Laguna's card. I'll say that. Elena never even played it. I beat her a bunch of times, uh, more than I beat Piet for the Alexander card, and yet she would never actually put the Laguna card into play. I never even saw it. And so I gave up on that. So I know there's other ways to get that card as long as you complete the card quest within the Balam Garden club. So which I have. So I've done that. So I think I'll be able to get the Laguna card later if I need it for some reason. But yeah, that's my main side quest, right? Trying to get all the cards. Then I'll do my best to do that.
Or sorry, I haven't been able to play cards in a while since the random rule has taken root everywhere. Open, sudden death, it's trade. It's all sorts of nonsense now. It's not even cards. It's it's I my next playthrough I will certainly be doing this better and I think it'll go a lot smoother. But well, I'm looking forward to what we play through for next time, whether we continue to pigeonhole ourselves and get constrained by the rapidly approaching future that or time compression, which Ultimacia is trying to bring about. Um, or whether we manage to take a more expansive view of things and take a look around, even with the meteor in the sky. As it.
Good. Stopping and smelling the rose. I'm definitely going to go after Doom Train. I'm going to
Okay.
bust Rinoa out and try to get some Marlboro tentacles and some medical supplies to forge my Doom Train out of my Solomon ring.
Doom Train. Okay, I'll look into what Doom Train takes and see if I can.
You got to do Tonberry still, though. You got to get Tonberry. That's the money. Yeah.
Okay, yeah, I need to get that little knife wielding buckaroo. I have another thing I call him in private. In any case, well, until next time, my friend.
Sounds good. Take care.
Signing off and hitting the save point.